Okay, so when thinking about escalation and de-escalation, it's really important to realize that today we're going over a general overview. So we're still thinking about tier 1, we're thinking about all students. And if you think about escalation, I'm sure we've all been through them, right? Have we gone through a time when we've gotten angry about something, seen ourselves escalate, or possibly our children or folks around us? So it's something that happens in everyday life with everybody. So I want us to keep that in our brains as we're going through this information, that we're looking at all students as a tier 1 practice. And again, it's a general overview. So we're going to go through this in that kind of format. When we look at escalation and de-escalation, it's important to look at the key strategies and the key messages behind it. So I look at prevention is key. I think we know that if you can intervene early and stop behaviors before they escalate, we have better outcomes for students. So we want to look at prevention and early intervention. That's where you get your biggest bang for your buck. We also want to look at changing adult behavior and our responses to behavior. So a few slides ago, Jen and Brandy were discussing the function-based thinking and how we look at behavior as related to function. So keep that in mind as well. Our adult behavior, we need to look at what can we do to minimize triggers and how can we manipulate environments to make students most successful. And how can we learn from experience? So when an escalation does happen, how do we learn from that experience to identify skill gaps and teachable moments for students and what we need to go back and reteach and work on for skills for kids? There's also a clear link with this material to day 4 when we talked about the 10 evidence-based strategies in classroom management. So there's that clear link to what are some good teacher practices. So we're going to look at those again when we go through each of these steps. And again, applying this to the prevent, teach, reinforce, and respond logic, that we want to keep all of that in mind. So, like I had mentioned, we want to look at intervening early. We want to look at what are the environmental factors and what are those replacement behaviors that we're going to teach and work on with kids. So the model that we're using has 7 phases. We're going to go through each of these phases individually, looking at descriptions of them and ways that we intervene. So the 7 phases are there on our graphic here: calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery. I think it's important to note, since I've been emphasizing prevention and early intervention, that typically happens in the first 3 phases there of calm, trigger, and agitation. That's your key to your success. If you can intervene early, much better outcomes, because typically once an escalation does accelerate, you got to kind of let it run its course. So this is where we want to focus our efforts on prevention and looking at those stages. We start with calm. You think about most students generally enter the classroom in a calm behavior manner. They're there ready to learn, engaged, cooperative, responsive. So we're starting with calm. Like I said, the student's cooperative. They're accepting that corrective feedback. So you might give them a redirection and they're following that along. They're setting personal goals, following those goals, ignoring distractions, accepting praise. They're following your school-wide expectations. They're on track. So what do you want to do when a student's calm? We want to keep them there. So like I said, you're going to focus on prevention. The important piece that I like to highlight to teachers is you need to know your students. You need to have relationships with your students. So if you know about your kids, then you can identify areas that you want to prevent. So if you know what certain triggers are, if you know behaviors that they've experienced before, how have you intervened that's worked previously. Thinking back to the session on function-based thinking, what are all of those good teaching practices that you're going to do to prevent behaviors? Are you going to remind, pre-correct? Are we going to prompt them in a certain way? Are we going to highly reinforce when they're doing the right thing? So if a student's being calm and following our expectations, we're going to make sure that we're giving our reinforcement for those. And we want to teach skills. So that's also the other piece of the function-based thinking. We want to ensure that the student is aware of all of these strategies and all of these skills. God bless you. Oops. Next phase is looking at triggers. This is typically when something happens for a student. I give the example of a student might be on task, then they need to transition to a new task. They might need help with that task and their peer sitting next to them says, "Oh, this is so easy, you need help." How many times do we see peers interact that way? So that can be a trigger for a student, a peer interaction in that way. So something happens that causes a student to get agitated. That's what we're looking at in the trigger phase. So there are different antecedents. I stepped ahead here. Looking at the description of what that phase is, it could be different for all students. So what is a trigger for one kid can be a very different trigger for another student. So again, going back to that relationship piece and knowing what triggers are for certain students. Some students, it's related to failures, academic struggles that they might be having, so the high academic demand. It could be related to skill deficits. It could be related to school and non-school events. So if you think about if they're coming to school hungry, tired, all of those things can be triggers for them. Can be conflicts. So I've been asking for a pencil and nobody's responding to me. So now I'm going to start escalating because I've been asking and somebody's not responding to my request. So looking at different types of triggers are different for each student. Next time I do this, I need to make sure that it's just one click. Again, we're going to think about what we just did when we were looking at the calm phase. We still want to focus on prevention and early intervention. So when a trigger happens, what can we do for that student? Anybody have any ideas of what you can do if the example that I gave, a student was working and transitioning to a new activity, a peer said, "Oh, you need help, you can't do this." What's something that you could do in a preventative way?
It's prompting and reminding all kids about their respect level for somebody else, that everybody learns differently, or just that everybody gets what they need. So how do you make sure that you model for everyone the types of things that they say to each other?
Awesome. So I heard a couple things there. One was a teach piece for peers. So how do we get peers to be all on the same page and understand student need? Also the prompting and cueing. So how can we, if this is a challenge, make sure you raise your hand and ask for help and pre-correct for those behaviors. So that's a couple good suggestions. It's making sure that we are doing all of the good practices that we've already been doing. So prompting, cueing, pre-correcting, making sure the student has access to the supports that they need, that they've practiced those supports, that they've been taught those supports, and that we are sticking to our plan. So we need to understand the function and then have our plan based on that ABC chart there of what are we going to do to prevent the problem, how are we going to teach this, and then how are we going to respond. How are we going to increase the opportunities for success and reinforce what has been taught? And I think this goes back to your Tier 1 strategy. So how are you using your acknowledgement system for students when problems are occurring? So how can I, even though a student might start to be exhibiting some of the triggering behaviors, how can I reinforce him when he does calm down and when he does raise his hand to ask for help? That we're going to differentiate how we're acknowledging during those phases and making sure that we're going back to our Tier 1 supports. So then we're going to move through the rest of the phases from Janet.